to start by introducing to you the background of our webinar. We all know from research as well from practice that physical inactivity is a high risk factor for non-communicable diseases, but also for increasing mortality. And although there is concrete evidence-based knowledge about the health-related effects of physical activity and concrete recommendations for specific target groups, physical inactivity is still prevalent. Therefore, we asked ourselves the seemingly simple question, what do we actually need to promote physical activity? We would like to explore this question at different levels. We would like to look at current trends and guidelines on physical activity. We want to highlight innovative theoretical approaches for inactivity and exercise. And we want to explain practical methods for implementing evidence-based interventions to promote physical activity and how to implement them while considering environmental factors. To address these levels, we could invite great international speakers for this webinar. Dr. Regina Guthold from the World Health Organization, Professor Dr. Ralf Brandt from the University of Potsdam, Professor Dr. Catherine Woods from the University of Limerick, and Professor Dr. Genevieve Dunton from the University of Southern California. We are very pleased that they have taken the time today to discuss with us the topic, what do we need to promote physical activity? And now I'm happy to introduce you to our first speaker, Dr. Regina Guthold, with the topic Global Physical Activity Levels and Trends and what can be done for improvement. Dr. Regina Guthold is a scientist working on adolescents' health monitoring and evaluation in the Department of Maternal, Newborn, Child and Adolescents Health at the World Health Organization. She holds a PhD in health science along with master's degrees in public health and sports science. She has over 10 years work experience in surveillance, monitoring and evaluation of populations' health with a focus on physical activity. She has supported governance of over 50 countries around the world in the implementation of surveillance systems.
The unfavorable effects of sedentary behavior for children include adiposity, cardiometabolic health, fitness, behavioral conduct, and sleep. So there are unfavorable effects for all of these things from sedentary behavior, that is basically too much sitting. For adults, the negative effects of sedentary behavior include negative effects on mortality, and that includes all-cause and cause-specific mortality, as well as cardiovascular disease, specific cancers, and type 2 diabetes. All the evidence is brought together in the global guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior from the WHO. And these guidelines were first released in 2010, and they were updated with new evidence in 2020, so pretty recent. This document, you can see the link at the bottom of the slide, includes guidelines for several population groups: children and adolescents aged 5 to 17 years, adults and older adults, and also specific population subgroups, for example, people with a chronic condition or pregnant women. One of the main messages in the guidelines is that every move counts. Doing some physical activity is better than doing none, even if the activity is light. However, there is a recommended range of physical activity, and that's equivalent to approximately 150 to 300 minutes of moderate activity per week for adults. Greater amount of physical activity brings greater benefits. At some point, the risks and harms become more important, but that's really when you do a lot of physical activity. The specific guidelines for adults and older adults include the following. The main and longest standing physical activity guideline is to do at least 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, or equivalent, which would the same would be 75 minutes of vigorous activity per week, or a combination of the two. That is the main physical activity guideline with the greatest body of evidence behind. If you do more, you get greater benefits. There are also other recommendations, including one should do at least on 2 days a week muscle strengthening activities. And also on at least 3 days a week, varied multi-component physical activity. And that includes things like coordination, flexibility, balance, and these things. One final recommendation is to limit the amount of time spent sitting and to replace as much as possible this time spent sitting with physical activity of any intensity. The guidelines for children and adolescents are different to the ones for adults. Children and adolescents should do more than adults. They should do at least 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity. And that includes active play, that includes cycling to school, that includes physical education class, could be anything, as long as it adds up to 60 minutes a day. The recommendation also includes that children should do on 3 days a week vigorous intensity aerobic activities, and that's part of the 60 minutes. So some of it should be vigorous. They should sweat and their heartbeat should come up. And they should also limit the amount of time spent being sedentary. And that's particularly true for recreational screen time. And again here, the longest standing physical activity guideline for children and adolescents is to do at least 1 hour of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. For children and adolescents, this is the one with the greatest body of evidence behind. Now the question is, do people meet these guidelines? Let's look at adults first. Does the global adult population meet the physical activity guidelines? In 2016, as you can see from this graph, 32% of women and 23% of men in the adult ages did not meet the long-standing guideline of doing at least 150 minutes of moderate activity or equivalent per week in 2016. So from the graph, the red line is females, the blue line is males. You can see this is not meeting recommendations. So females tend to not meet the recommendations more than men. Now, if we project that line into the future, into the year 2030, you see the projected line, which is the longer stripes there. What you also see on the graph is the WHO target. That's the smaller dots that go down, that reduce inactivity. This target was set by WHO member states, and it is to reduce the prevalence of inactivity by 50% by 2030. But if current trends continue, if nothing is done to reduce inactivity, this target that all of the WHO member states have signed up to will not be met. These levels and trends in inactivity are not the same for different income groups. The first 4 bars represent the global picture, what you've also just seen in the other chart. But then it's split up into low income, middle income, and high income. So each group of bars represents a group of countries of low, middle, and high income. The blue bars are males, the red bars are females, and they represent the years 2001 and 2016. Now you can see the prevalence of physical inactivity, of not meeting the guidelines, is lowest in low-income countries and highest in high-income countries. Across the board, women tend to be less active than men, but you can also see that the trend of inactivity is going up among adults in high-income countries. So this is going in the wrong direction. Let's look at adolescents. Do adolescents meet the guidelines? And I remind you, the guidelines are different for adolescents. They're supposed to do an hour of physical activity per day. Well, in the year 2016, that's estimates from WHO, 85% of girls globally and 78% of boys aged 11 to 17 years did not meet this physical activity guideline. The trends have unfortunately been pretty stable. Things have not improved since 2001. And if we project forward, if nothing is done, they won't change. You can see again on this chart, the target that was agreed by WHO member states. That's the line with the small dots. It's supposed to go down again by 15% by 2030, but if nothing is done, it won't go down. Here, among adolescents, the picture is different when we look at the different income groups. You can see the groups of bars representing low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, and high income. And among adolescents, we do not see that inactivity is greater among countries of high income as compared to countries of low income. It's pretty high across the board, no matter what the income group is. But I should also say that the data used here are adolescents that go to school, because data from adolescents that are not at school is lacking. So there might be a little bit of a bias in this here, but still, so adolescents that do go to school are pretty inactive, no matter how what the income group of their country is. Now let's look at one other aspect of these guidelines among young people, and that's the sitting time. One of the aspects of the guidelines is to limit the amount of time being spent sedentary. And this is a random selection of countries in this bar here, in this bar chart here. Again, blue is males and red is females. These are countries that have done a WHO survey called the Global School-Based Student Health Survey. And this represents the percentage of adolescents that sit for 3 or more hours in their free time. It represents students that are aged 13 to 15 years. And as I said, it's a random selection of countries. But you can see a very wide range in this prevalence. It goes from as low as around 10% in Nepal, for example, in 2015, to up then to more than 60%, for example, among female adolescents from Bahrain, adolescents from Kuwait, or also female adolescents from the United Arab Emirates. So a wide range in prevalence of sitting time across countries. I should say that time spent sitting at school or for homework was not considered here. This is only sitting free time. Some considerations and limitations of these data that I've just presented. We do have a relatively good global data coverage for the main components of the physical activity guidelines. And when I say main components, I mean the 150 minutes per week for adults and the 1 hour per day for adolescents. So pretty good coverage there. Although the coverage is more limited in low-income countries. I should also say that most of these data presented are based on self-report. And as we all know, self-reported data have their limitations. This is based on surveys that have asked students or adults how much physical activity they do. And that's because that's just the available data out there. There is relatively little data out there from objective measurement of physical activity that would be putting devices on people's wrists, for example, to measure their movement. Not that much data out there yet, especially from low and middle income countries. There are big data gaps and very inconsistent data on the other components of the physical activity guidelines. For example, the component for adolescents to do vigorous intensity physical activity on at least 3 days per week. Not much data out there on this component. Not much out there on muscle strengthening activities either for adults, for adolescents. It's just not being assessed, not being measured in surveys currently. And we also have pretty inconsistent data on sitting time or screen time. But we do know enough that we need to do something about it. The levels of inactivity are too high. This is what we know already, even if there are limitations and gaps in data. And that's why WHO member states have requested WHO to develop the Global Action Plan on Physical Activity 2018 to 2030. The abbreviation for this is GAPA. This document was developed through a worldwide consultation process involving governments and stakeholders from many sectors. And the vision of the plan is to have more active people for a healthier world. The target, I've mentioned it before, is to reduce physical inactivity by 15% in adults and adolescents by 2030. The plan has 4 objectives. The objectives of the plan are, number 1, to create active societies. Number 2, to create active environments. Number 3, to create active people. And number 4, to create active systems. The plan includes 20 policy actions. They are all classified under these 4 objectives. And I've just put a few examples on the slide here so that the objectives become a little bit clearer. So the first objective, to create active societies. Some proposed actions in the GAPA would be for countries to implement regular and free physical activity mass participation initiatives. Another example for an action is to strengthen training of professionals, and that could be health professionals, for example, to increase relevant knowledge and skills around physical activity. Examples for action under the objective number 2, to create active environments, would be to create the space for safe walking and cycling to school and work, or to improve the provision of public open space where children and adults and older adults and all population groups can be more active. If the environment does not allow for physical activity, well, then it's very difficult to increase physical activity levels. Examples of actions under objective 3, to create active people, include to strengthen the provision of good quality physical education, or to do more physical activity programs and more physical activity promotion, to create the opportunities for people to be more active. Actions under objective 4, to create active systems, are, for example, to engage other sectors in physical activity promotion. And that's very much needed. For example, if we want to promote physical activity, we need schools to be on board, and that's the education sector. They need to work with the health sector in order to be able to promote physical activity. Or also the transport sector, if we really want to change the environment to be more physical activity friendly. Build cycling paths, build the safe space for walking in cities, for example, where there is a lot of traffic. There are many more specific actions for different stakeholders in Appendix 2 of the GAPA, and they're all grouped under these 4 objectives. And collectively, all of these actions form a whole system approach to increasing physical activity opportunities. And there is also another document, it's called Active, a technical package for increasing physical activity. And this document provides guidance on how to implement this approach. WHO supports countries with implementation. So these 2 documents go along together, GAPA and Active, and they have lots of actions proposed for different stakeholders. Here is a summary of the presentation I just gave. We have seen that large proportions of global populations do not meet the WHO guidelines on physical activity and sedentary behavior. More and better data, including for specific aspects of activity behaviors, will be important for targeted actions. We have seen there is a lack of data for many of the specific aspects of physical activity, for example, strength training. The GAPA offers a menu of actions to promote physical activity. And Active, this other document, provides guidance on how to implement these actions. Now I come to the last slide. The organizers of the webinars have asked that we think about the question, what are the cornerstones needed to successfully change physical activity and lifestyle behavior? I think from this presentation, we have seen 3 things. One is more and better data, including for specific aspects of activity behaviors is needed. I think we've also seen a whole systems approach with work on multiple levels is needed. And that includes the individual level, work with people, work with families, but also communities, the whole society, the environment, and the whole system in order to promote physical activity. We also need political commitment at the highest level and across sectors if we're serious about physical activity promotion. This brings me to the end of my presentation. I would like to thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Regina, for that great insight into the trends and into what the WHO has been doing to get the trends on the level that we would like to see in the future. I would like to welcome everyone again, if they have any questions, to add them in the comment section, and I shall moderate them. So we have a first question from somebody from the audience that I'd like to ask to you, Regina. How does WHO collect data on global physical inactivity? What kind of investigation tool was implemented for that purpose?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So we do have WHO supported surveys for adults and for adolescents. The adult survey is called STEPS. The adolescent survey is called GSHS, the Global School-Based Student Health Survey. These are both multi-component surveys. They look at multiple risk factors, not just physical activity. They also look at tobacco, they look at alcohol, they look at mental health, for example. And WHO supports the implementation in that, for example, a WHO team would go to a country and train the country team on how this survey should be implemented, how the sample should be drawn, how the questions should be asked. So this is one way of WHO collecting data. But also I should say that WHO uses data that is being collected in countries through other mechanisms, through national surveys. All this information is also brought together at WHO and be looked at. So there's different ways of collecting data. And I should also say that WHO also is starting to support implementing objective measurement of physical activity in some countries, where it's more in some countries at the piloting stage still. There are quite a number of studies out there that have used objective physical activity measurement in populations, but these data are mostly from high-income countries and not so much from middle-income countries. But we are currently in the process of testing if data collection of physical activity objective data would work at a large scale in low and middle income countries as well.
Thank you very much for that answer. I think we're all quite occupied with how we can really measure it accurately and fill those gaps that you mentioned. We do have another question that I would like to go for before we move on. That is, what is the WHO's position with respect to professional health coaching?
Professional health coaching, what could the person that asked the question clarify what's meant by that, professional health coaching?
I don't know if we can technically get that information that quickly, but what I can tell is that we are running some projects, for instance, where we have individual one-on-one health coaching with a physical activity coach and somebody who is wanting to become more physically active, I guess. And here it would be maybe, does the WHO offer any support for health coaching, or would that be supported, the general concept?
So just for me to understand better, that would, for example, be physical activity promotion through health professionals?
As I understood the question, it's health coaching, so professionals who specialize in just health coaching. So it need not necessarily be a health professional. It could be, for instance, a sports scientist or a psychologist who's decided to specialize in health coaching, lifestyle coaching, maybe even. Okay.
I'm not aware of any WHO initiatives around that, but on the other side, what I mentioned just before, there are specific actions for better training of health professionals in physical activity promotion in the GAPA. So that is part of the GAPA, the pre-training and how to say that, the pre-training of professionals, but also to train professionals that are already doing their job in how to promote physical activity. That's part of the GAPA.
Okay, yeah, which is also very important because everyone's take on physical activity may be different. So good coaching is, of course, a great place to start with that.
Yes, and if this did not answer the question, I'm happy for the participant to contact you and you can forward the question to me and we can clarify that.
Yes, thank you so much for that offer. And I'm sure one also finds a lot of information online, under the WHO websites. Thank you so much. We shall move on now. Exactly, we can change the screen sharing. Up next, we're very pleased to announce that we have Professor Ralf Brandt with us. He was born and lives in Germany. He graduated in sport and exercise science, as well as in psychology at the University of Constance. After his habilitation at the University of Stuttgart, he was appointed full professor of sport and exercise psychology at the University of Potsdam, and additionally as an affiliate professor of kinesiology at Iowa State University in the US. He's also the editor-in-chief of the German Journal of Exercise and Sport Research. And we're very thrilled to have him here to tell us a little more about the effective reflective theory of physical inactivity and exercise. Ralf, the screen is yours.
Thanks, Robin. Great that you're here, and thanks for the invitation and the next 15 minutes. Okay, so you should see a white screen now, which is mine. So let me jump right into what I plan to present today with 2 slides as a prelude. Now, Regina has told us and described the situation, how it is. And thankfully, she also pointed us towards this WHO initiatives, how we could change it. Now, I imagine myself speaking to experts in physical activity and exercise promotion, and I would like to start with you just checking our track record. Our track record as experts in promoting physical activity and exercise. And I have picked out only one of the, as it seems to me, most relevant publications that tell us about the impact of what we do actually as experts and psychologists or health behavior specialists in real life. So this is a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. And I would like to digest together with me the highlighted 2 sentences. 1, results show that theory-based interventions significantly impact the PA behavior of participants. Yay, great, this is great. There is a significant impact, but check with what you learned in statistics and check Cohen's D, which is the effect size we typically reach. Probably you remember that a D of 0.3 brings about a 58% chance that a person picked at random from the treatment group will have higher scores, that is more physical activity, than a person picked at random from the control group. 58% chance of superiority statistically. So that's not much more than a coin toss. So probably we are not as far as we would like to be actually with that. Second highlighted sentence, there is no efficacy difference between theories. As a matter of fact, you can take this or that theory and it wouldn't change a lot. We have that small to moderate effect size, that is the 58% chance of probability of superiority as a matter of fact. Second slide for the prelude. If we look at the popularity of theories of behavior change that we can see in the published literature, we got the following graph. What you see there is that researchers kept on working with the theories of behavior change that are published in the literature, and there is an increase in work in research articles published year by year. You even see that very steep increase in empirical research related to self-determination theory. And although I like seeing that so many experts care about that topic and that we're like motivated to change something, but remember the essence of my first slide. We are using theories to optimize our interventions, which are, let me call them suboptimal, far suboptimal from what we really would actually like to reach with them. So what I'm planning to do in the next 10 minutes is that I introduce you an alternative theory, that is an alternative perspective on how we could manage to become better, in a sense of become more efficient with what we're doing in our interventions. It is a new theory which is not thought to substitute things we know and things that work well, but it's a supplementary perspective that might help to change something. So I will talk about theory today and not too much about empirical research. The effective reflective theory was published in 2019 and has reached quite attention or some attention in the meanwhile. And at the core of the theory is what I tried to illustrate with the boxing gloves up there. Many of us know, or many people know, that exercise is healthy. But sometimes exercising feels unpleasant. And this conflict is at the heart of effective reflective theory. So let me first describe what I mean when I'm talking about feelings. We refer to neurobiological research. And if I'm talking about feelings, I'm talking about core affect. Core affect, as it was defined by Lisa Feldman Barrett and her colleague. And she gave that very simple and concise definition, which I like very much. Feelings are like simple summaries about what's going on in your body. That's perspective. Summaries about what's going on in your body are non-reflective in a way that you don't need to think a lot about them. They are always there as soon as you put attention on them. And normally, if it comes to research, you would measure those feelings with something close to that affect circumplex. That is, if I ask you now, how do you feel? You probably might be able to answer with regard to how pleasant or unpleasant you feel right now, which is valence, or whether you are highly aroused or activated, or whether there is rather low activation at the moment. So when I'm talking about feeling and affect, I'm talking about core affect in exactly that sense. Now, let me talk about how people feel during exercise. And this is empirical data for a first step. So imagine yourself sitting on that bike ergometer, and you are doing a high intensity, a graded exercise stress test. This is what we did with participants in our lab. And this is data we measured, that is random participants picked out. And what you see on the x-axis is their rating of perceived exertion towards the end. And the last measurement point was volitional exhaustion. And on the y-axis, you see the effective valence rated by these people. And what you see is trivial, in fact. It is that the higher the intensity gets, the more negative, the more unpleasant you feel. Very, very easy. Just imagine running a marathon. The last kilometer on your marathon will never feel pleasant. So if you're getting really exhausted, if you are like physiologically at your personal limit, this doesn't feel well. And there is one very important theory, and there are in the meanwhile several dozens, if not hundreds, of empirical studies illustrating results on that theory, dual mode theory, that aims to explain how intensity and affect relate to each other. So most basically, dual mode theory describes that within 3 domains of physical activity or exercise: moderate, heavy, or severe intensity, which are linked to the ventilatory thresholds, in fact. We will have a typical trajectories of affect. That is, most people, many people would report feeling better if they exercise or are physically active in the moderate domain. As soon as they come close to the ventilatory thresholds, people will differ in the way they feel. Some individuals will report less pleasurable feelings, while others will report increasing pleasurable feelings. But as soon as you reach the severe domain, uniformly, individuals will report unpleasurable, unpleasant feelings. The dual mode theory explains this empirical findings in a way that the two modes, one of it is cognitive and the other one relates to the interoceptive factors that create that bodily sensations, interact in the way it is shown here. Now, building upon dual mode theory, affective reflective theory has at its core the idea that there are more rational reflective processes, which are named type 2 processes on the one hand, and affective type 1 processes that might counteract your beliefs, values, and individuals' rational considerations. So one fundamentally new idea that comes with the ART is that we have driving forces that can get into conflict with restraining forces. And the ART specifies these restraining forces in a way that it postulates that exercising feels unpleasant sometimes and under the conditions I just try to describe you with my hint on dual mode theory. So this is affective reflective theory, the process model of effective reflective theory. I will only go very briefly over it, but I will send, or I actually have sent now, a link in the chat to an explanational video on YouTube where you could, if you like, rehearse the things, or you could use that resource for teaching, for example. So affective reflective theory postulates that every exercise-related stimulus will result in a type 1, that is an automatic process that will include automatic associations related to that exercise-related stimulus that creates an automatic affective valuation. That's the core construct of the theory, automatic affective valuation. What it means is the affective valuation is what you automatically feel in relation to an exercise-related stimulus. And that automatic affective valuation will create an action impulse that makes you, or that pushes you in the direction of the behavior, or that gives you a sort of avoidance impulse. In case, and only in the case, that self-control resources are available, reflective evaluation might follow. That is, if you have the self-control, if you are motivated and have the capacity to rationally consider your options and to choose what you want to do, it is possible that you can resist an automatic impulse to avoid physical effort or to decide against going exercising. But the role of self-control is crucial for the theory. And I would like to highlight a second aspect that's coming with the affective reflective theory. It postulates that negative automatic affective valuations are learned. And the whole theory is about learning to like exercise, because as a matter of fact, we all know that it will not always be pleasurable to exercise, as there is that connection to physical inactivity I have just described a few minutes ago. So first thing you should try to see when you're looking at the theory, or if you would like to join in researching with that theory. Is there anything like an automatic process that will influence our decisions and that will have that impact on physical activity behavior? And I've just picked out one study from my group in Potsdam, in which we simply did the following. We asked 88 participants to complete an implicit association test, an IAT, which is a test that is able, or that aims to measure automatic processes or automatic associations. And we asked that participants to complete that tests before a 14-week training program. And what we see here is that we were able to discriminate between those who managed to stay in the program by their implicit or automatic associations with exercise. As a matter of fact, you will see, if you go into the literature, that research studies are accumulating that automatic processes are relevant, and that this might be one of the factors that might have been neglected in the past 20 years. That not everything in our decisions, or not all motivational drivers, are reflective, but there is something automatic going on, and that we have to keep that in mind. Let me come back and get to an end with my presentation. I showed you data from that study here. And what we did in that study was that at the same time, we were measuring people's facial expressions, because we thought, is it possible to see pleasant or unpleasant feelings in their faces? Obviously it was, but if there are like signs that can be used, for example, during interventions, and we use AI software to classify, to use algorithms and classify facial expressions. And to summarize, what we see there is that we were able to separate and identify something we call the face of exertion, or facial expressions that are characteristic for affective, for feelings of unpleasantness. And you can look at my face now, because it's easy to illustrate the face of affect. So if you see that somebody's getting exhausted, he or she will open his or her mouth. That is a jaw drop, which is perfectly logical. You need more air while exercising. But as soon as unpleasant feelings mix in, there will come nose wrinkle. Nose wrinkle is something like that. Now, if people start doing something like that, nose wrinkling, this seems to be a good identifier for unpleasant affect during exercise. So I would like to give you, for the end, this picture here. So you see somebody exercising here. What is your diagnosis? How does this person feel during exercising? Does she feel well? Will it have an impact whether she feels well or not? Will these feelings have an effect on her subsequent further decisions to regularly engage in exercise? Is it worth avoiding to create these kinds of feeling, for example, during physical education? Is it necessary to always work at high intensities? These are questions that you might find interesting, and this is what I wanted to present today. So thanks for giving me the chance to giving you that impulse, and well, happy to hear your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Brandt, for that very lively and I think relatable way in which you explained the theories to us. I'm going to go directly to the first question. I find it very interesting to consider the role of valence of doing exercise for behavior change. Does the valence after the exercise, pleasant, better mobility, unpleasant muscle cramp, play a similar role to the valence during exercise? So I think it's a timing question.
Yes, it does play a role, but it plays a marginal role. Affect, if you measure affect after exercising, you will have an effective rebound effect. That is, imagine the following. Imagine that exercise stress test. I don't know whether you ever had to do something like that. It's terrible. I can tell you the last minutes are terrible. You're going to be stressed out by that. So if you ask somebody immediately before that exercise stress test, how do you feel right now? This person would probably tell you, well, yes, okay, but she or he will feel slightly worse than usual because she's expecting something. So now you're doing that test, and under severe, highest intensity, effective or pleasurable feelings will be gone. The person will feel terrible. But as soon as the test is over, there will be a rebound, and it will be a huge rebound. Usually people will then tell you that they feel even better than before, and the only reason for that is because it's over. They can breathe again. Yeah? So you have that effective rebound that is responsible for many, many artifacts we used in research in the past 20 years, and that artifacts were created by only measuring before and after. There are a few meta-analyses telling you that there is zero correlation between affect measured after PA and future behavior, and significant correlation between affect measured during exercise and physical activity and subsequent exercising.
Thank you very much for that insight and interesting discussion on measurement, especially during exercise. But I will go on to the next question from the audience. So thank you for this interesting talk. I would be interested in predictors for positive effect towards exercise, and relate to this starting points for interventions. What do we already know about this? So we're moving a little more into the practical side.
Yes. Okay. What we know from the past 40 years in exercise psychology is that, for example, weighing the pros and cons or rationalizing about how you feel and what you should do or what you should not do, that all these reflective considerations can help in, let me say, rearranging your behavior. But what is important, that acute feelings felt during exercise have shown to be critical. So there are two ways of dealing with these things. First thing is, highest intensities, high or severe physical activity will cause negative feelings uniformly. But it is possible to rationalize them. And the open research question, in fact, is to what extent you are motivated or able to rethink what you actually felt. And so what I would recommend is not to abandon all the things we know about the cognitive factors that might influence your decisions. That's important. But to have set additional focus on how people feel during exercise, because this very immediate feelings and experience might play a much greater role than we actually thought in the past 40 years.
Thank you again, I think, for your very good explanation of the role of affect. And I think the theme of affect has affected many of our audience, because the questions are just rolling in. So we'd like to keep some maybe for the end of our discussion, and we would move on now. And I would love to present to you our next speaker. Catherine Woods is a professor of physical activity for health in the Department of Physical Education and Sports Sciences at the University of Limerick. There she leads the recently established Physical Activity for Health Research Cluster, which is a multidisciplinary group of core and associate members focused on physical activity research. Her research cuts across the themes of policy and practice. So she is also actually the deputy chair of the Policy Evaluation Network, which is a large EU project on nutrition, physical activity, and sedentary behavior, policy evaluation, benchmarking, and implementation. And now we're very much looking forward to hearing more about evidence-based interventions to promote physical activity with a focus on policy. So again, now the screen is yours to share, Catherine.
I think we need to unmute her. Jan, can you do that?
I invoke the power of my technical team to do that. Ah, there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Yeah.
The power was actually mine. There we go. Okay.
And can you see my slides?
No.
Oh, you can't yet. Okay,
no,
sorry.
I think you need to start the screen sharing.
Yeah.
Catherine, you're co-host now, so it should work.
There you go.
Perfect.
All right, so thank you so much for the invitation to present today. And thank you to Claudio, Robin and the team, and such a wonderful to see such a young team of ambitious and active young researchers in the area. So it's great to see that. I'm going to take some time today to speak to you about evidence-based interventions to promote physical activity, and the last one in particular with a focus on policy. These are two research programs that I've been involved with over the last number of years. One is using a pragmatic approach, using intervention mapping, and it's really focused at a program intervention. So how do we develop a program? What way do we go about doing that? And then looking at the impact of that program. And then the second one, IPARC, the Irish Physical Activity Research Collaboration, is a systems approach using enabling contexts, effective interventions and effective implementation methods together and combined to really address the population level challenges of physical inactivity. So let's start with Move for Life. So why Move for Life? Well, in 2016, Ireland published its first national physical activity plan. And this had one common goal, but multiple agendas. In other words, we had lots of different sectors feed into this. And you can see here the Minister of Health combined with the Minister of Transport, Tourism and Sport jointly launching this program. And within that, they had goals and targets for adults and older adults. So there was a mandate to increase physical activity among adults. When it came to the Move for Life intervention, we were informed, or we took a pragmatic approach. And the reason for that was we wanted it to be applicable to real life. And the pragmatic design included a research questions relevant to increasing physical activity in inactive adults over the age of 50. We wanted it to be accessible intervention in a setting that was as close to usual care as possible. And we wanted to provide more applicable information to enabling participants and providers and policymakers to make informed decisions about the feasibility of existing community-based programs. So while explanatory or efficacy trials conducted under ideal conditions play an important role in scientific discovery, pragmatic, health promoting interventions are seldom delivered or monitored under circumstances similar to more constrained trials, highlighting the need for the pragmatic trials as well. And you can see there a quote from Michael Pratt and Rodrigo Ruiz in relation to the use or the need for research being done in real world settings. So we used a co-design process to augment well-known existing programs within the research components aligned to them. And the results draw upon 4 pillars of evidence-based practice outlined by Thompson and colleagues: research evidence, practice evidence, participant preference, and context or contextual evidence. This effort recognizes the value of practice-based evidence pathways as an essential component to the more established evidence-based practice pathways when designing and evaluating population health interventions. Move for Life used evidence-based pragmatic approach, where each phase informed and completed the next phase. So for example, we used evidence and theory of what was existing already in relation to older adults to begin the process. We then spoke to our stakeholders, key stakeholders in the area, and grounded in practice and policy. In other words, how to improve participant recruitment and retention, intervention sustainability and scalability, and potential role for peer mentoring within any intervention. Importantly also are the perspectives of the participants, and we had opportunities to discuss the feasibility and acceptability of intervention strategies and the materials that we would use and how these could be improved. And finally, we wanted the contextual evidence in terms of balancing scientific rigor and real-world pragmatism in intervention development and implementation, considering resources and relevant policies. To operationalize the 4 pillars of evidence-based practice, we use the intervention mapping approach to planning programs. And this is grounded in a community-based participatory research approach. Intervention mapping provides a systematic process and detailed protocol for effective step-by-step decision-making for intervention development, considering multiple levels of influence on behavior modification of a 12-week program or a 10-week program or an 8-week program. And in its original formulation, intervention mapping approach is very logical and straightforward. Step 1, develop your logic model. Step 2, the logic model of change. Step 3, select your theory-based intervention methods and translate them into practice. Step 4, integrate the practical application into an organized program. Step 5, consider implementation and sustainability. And step 6, generate an evaluation plan and conduct your outcome and process evaluation. And that's the intervention mapping approach. However, in reality, it's not logical nor straightforward, it's iterative. And some of the steps that happen later inform, you go back and you revise your logic model, you develop your logic model of change further, and so on. So we had the 4 pillars of evidence, we had the intervention mapping protocol. What was, or how did we come up with our intervention? Well, we looked at what evidence was already in practice. These are examples of 4 national programs that are designed to promote physical activity that had different levels of evidence behind them. Some published peer-reviewed evidence, others more evidence, practice-based evidence. But they all followed a tradition of what I would call a traditional model. You have one development officer, sports development officer or tutor who is educated in the program, and they go out into a community, they recruit their participants and they run the program for example, 12 weeks. We wanted to change that and develop it. The first thing that we wanted to do with the sports development officer was build their knowledge of behavioral change techniques and build their knowledge around group dynamics, group cohesion, and really how they would integrate within a group to help that group sustain over the long term. So we worked with the development officers for 2 days, 6 hours, and they had homework assignments. And we covered, using social cognitive theory, we covered things like behavioral and cognitive skills. We covered social support strategies. We used elements of self-determination theory. And underneath all of this, we underpinned it all with good pedagogical techniques in how you teach, provide feedback, and so on. Here's an example of confidence. This is on one of the questions that we assessed with the tutors. You can see confidence levels, and you can see how the blue was before, and then the orange bars are afterwards. And this is looking at behavioral skills pre and then post. And you can see in general, their confidence in teaching behavioral skills through the exercise increased. So the idea is that this new tutor as such goes into the traditional program. And then what they do is they identify individuals nominated by the peers to help them help others sustain the program long term. These individuals come out to us, they receive training in group sustainability, program sustainability, developing group norms, and they plug back into the program, but now they are what we call peer mentors. And these peer mentors work with the tutor to try and change the sustainability of this group. And this is repeated depending on the number of people who are interested and the demand for the program. The idea being that when the tutor moves on to their next program and the next community, they have left behind a group that is more educated towards sustaining itself, its own motivation. They know, for example, how to get additional tutors. They know where to get funding to expand or to get new services in. They know the resources in the local area, be other groups they could tap into, or even just the geographical area and what it provides for physical activity. And this is an example of our peer training. This was one time off 3 hours. And we evaluated it through a pilot cluster randomized control trial. So this is a pilot trial and we're going forward for definitive trial. You had 8 clusters, which are called local sports partnerships. We had over 700 individuals involved. 80% were female, so we had something to learn there. 37% had 3 or more chronic diseases, and 41% were obese. So we were getting the inactive and unfit. In terms of our feasibility criteria, we hit our fidelity marker. It was about 77%. We had 600 odd intervention elements that they had to deliver over the 12 weeks, but majority of those were delivered. In terms of retention and data completion, retention rates were 63%. Data completion rates were over 88%, and all study progression criteria were met. Interestingly, the control group had the highest retention rate, which is similar to other studies. And when we asked the participants about this, it was the fact that they were on a waitlist control that they felt was influential. In terms of the acceptability of the intervention, so notice now we only have 2 groups, Move for Life, which is the augmented intervention, and usual provision, which is the normal or traditional role. So we compared the augmented intervention to the usual role. And what you can see here is the percentage that agreed that the program was interesting, worth the time I invested in it, perceptions of group enjoyment, and would you recommend this program to a friend? So we wanted to know if the augmented program that we had provided, and also if the usual traditionally offered program were acceptable to participants. And this is where some of the statistical differences were found. One interesting finding as well was that we asked a question about the role of the assessment, because we were going out at baseline at 3 months after baseline, then 6 months after baseline, and doing a very rigorous assessment. And we wanted to know what the impact that was on the participants to give us feedback on if we can provide this type of a service in a routine way, would that, without the program in between, be of interest? And you can see that for the usual provision group, that was very much of interest, much more so than the Move for Life group. In In terms of behavior change techniques, you've got they enjoyed learning new strategies, they learned how to set personal goals, and they set a clear group. And you can see the Move for Life group are ahead of the usual provision group. 6 months after baseline measures, you can see that these I suppose these are still present. The knowledge of what the personal benefits to me are about physical activity, the barriers, how to get over those, and then my group goal, or our group have set a goal and are achieving that. In terms of social support and group dynamics, you can see here again evidence for the Move for Life augmented group having higher levels of social support and group dynamics at 3 months after baseline, post-intervention that is, and then more longer term. And in terms of physical activity behavior, we used mixed effects regression models here with intention to treat. And I don't have time to go into it in detail, but basically to say that accelerometer-based MVPA was consistently higher across time for participants in the Move for Life intervention group than for participants in usual provision, and particularly the control group. Specifically, compared to the control group, the difference at follow-up was 6.57 minutes daily in moderate to vigorous physical activity in favor of the Move for Life intervention group. Likewise, self-reported compliance with physical activity guidelines remains higher, consistently higher in the Move for Life intervention group than participants in the usual provision group. And remarkably, you can see it's up to 14 and 25 times higher than usual provision and control. If you look at other energy expenditure related behaviors, again, accelerometer derived like physical activity, numbers of steps and standing time consistently higher in the Move for Life intervention group than for those in usual provision or control groups. So to summarize on this, findings provided evidence of the goodness of existing local sport partnership programs, particularly for energy expenditure outcomes, and evidence of promise or added value for the Move for Life augmented intervention, and they warrant a definitive trial to further examine the effectiveness. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to have to move through this pretty quickly because I'm conscious of time, but moving away from the individual now to a more systems-based approach. And I'm going to pose some questions for the audience in this. So why IPARC? Again, we had policy, a policy action area 7, research, monitoring and evaluation, calling for, so at government level, saying we need to establish a research program to inform policies aimed at improving physical activity levels. We need to develop a national database for sharing examples of good practice, and we need to develop a standardized evaluation framework. So this led to a grant application to our Health Research Board, where the Department of Health joined forces with the University of Limerick to try and answer some of those questions that were in the physical activity policy. We brought together research institutes from all over the world, other government departments and government agencies, and we added to that a practitioner advisory group to keep it real and pragmatic, and a research advisory panel from other areas beyond our own island. And co-created, the group came up with the aim of IPARC, and you can see it there, and then the specific objectives, which were to seek ways to bridge gaps between best practice, to enable and support solutions to increase physical activity, to share learnings from research and best practice in a systematic way that is easily accessible, and to establish mechanisms for demonstrating the impact of IPARC. Essentially, what we were saying was, if you looked at the provision of physical activity opportunities in Ireland, there was a lot going on. There was some disorder and confusion, although we knew that these probably all had individual impact. What we wanted to get towards was not just coordinated impact, i.e. we're all addressing the similar agenda. We wanted to get to collective impact, where we're working together to meet that goal. So this formula became the basis for IPARC. We wanted to develop effective interventions that were effectively implemented in an enabling context, believing that that formula, which is exponential as opposed to additive, would lead to increased population physical activity levels. And how did we do it? We developed over a 3-year process, 3 different toolkits. And in brief, if we look at the systems toolkit, first of all, and you can get the paper and read about what is in this and how we've developed it. But essentially, it started with policy mapping. Who in Ireland at a policy level has a direct or indirect role to play in the promotion of physical activity? How do we then obtain buy-in from these individuals? And when we did that, we used the Global Action Plan. Regina presented on that. We used the GAPA to guide this. And one thing we did learn was that the systems pillar of GAPA is really, really important. We said it is the foundation pillar. They're not equally weighted potentially. And what we've learned also is that this systems map now is the end of the beginning. So when we got our systems map together of what we're doing well, what we need to do differently and strategies to do that, we are now at the end of the beginning. And we're using this information to inform the National Physical Activity Plan for Ireland Mark II. My question to you, though, as academics in this audience or researchers in this area is, how do we encourage the academic system to value this type of networking and collaboration building? This takes time. As a senior academic, I might have time to do this, but if I'm a junior academic with different metrics, how do I convince my peers that this type of work is of value? Our second kit was the evaluation toolkit. And for this, we did systematic literature review, and then we collected data on evaluation across exemplar interventions. And what did we learn? Well, one, any type of evaluation we do in physical activity in the community setting or in practice has to be pragmatic yet robust. So we need pragmatic and robust solutions. We need to get out of the lab and into where this physical activity is taking place. When we looked from the systematic literature review, there were 78 standardized evaluation frameworks available, very few in practice. So the usability of these frameworks is problematic. We had a practitioner advisory group that advised us and kept us real, and they are really, really important, and future solutions need to be enabled. And my question for you guys is, when it comes to evaluation, can we have it all? Or are we placing too high a bar on physical activity interventions in the real world setting? Can we have it robust? Can we have it pragmatic? And if yes, how? And our final toolkit is on implementation, effective implementation methods. If we've got good interventions in enabling context, we need to be able to implement them effectively. And for this, we conducted a systematic literature review, as well as, and I'm going to finish, I'm nearly finished. We conducted a systematic literature review, as well as 47 different interviews with policymakers, practitioners, commissioners of research programs, and the coordinators of these. And what we found was we used the consolidated framework for implementation research. This is a determinants framework for implementation. We found that the inner setting and individual characteristics are core. These are the key facilitators to effective implementation. The inner setting within which the intervention is run and the characteristics of the person who's running them. The intervention must fit into the policy agenda, as I've shown you earlier. Reflection and innovation. Whoever's running these on the ground needs to be able to reflect on what they're doing and innovate. That's what they're telling us. Broad partnerships are important, but the buy-in is really challenging, and consistency of implementation across countries and settings. In our systematic review, we found the similar things coming out in the US, coming out in Canada, coming out in Ireland, in Britain, and so on. My question is, how do we balance the practitioner's requirement for reflection and innovation with the researcher's requirement for fidelity? Or if individual characteristics in the inner setting are so important, what implications does this have for how we train our future professionals in this area? So the conceptual model is policy says there's a need, it's funded, activities are then developed and implemented and scaled up, builds into an evaluation report and a national database. And our toolkit informs every step of the way. Thank you very much to the research team on IPARC. That's our publications if you want to get them. Thank you also very much to the research team on the Move for Life study. And that's me. I'm done.
Thank you ever so much for your very interesting presentation. I think you gave us a really good insight into the complexity of the importance of the individual and moving towards societal impact. And also, of course, very thought-provoking questions, especially for us sitting in these seats as younger researchers. So I'd invite everyone again who is interested in asking a question just to write in the chat, and we're constantly gathering the questions, and I'll address them as best I can. So I'm going to switch over now to the audience questions. What role do you see for the multiplier in the system?
Okay, so I think it depends what is meant by multiplier in that context, but if the multiplier is the policymaker, which is essentially the person who's holding the purse strings in relation to what policy does, is it is the framework within which all of our programs are tendered, resourced, developed, and implemented. So if the multiplier in that instance is a policymaker, then they have a massive role in driving potentially where the research and evaluation will go in the future.
And you mentioned that buy-in is quite the challenge, right? So have you had any positive experiences with certain strategies on that front?
Yeah, it absolutely. Buy-in is definitely, you work with someone in transport, urban design, you work with someone in community setting or workplace, and they're saying, well, why am I here? We're talking about physical activity interventions. Well, you have to then work with them to understand their agenda. So if it's in transport, the agenda is about climate change, and physical activity can help with that in terms of sustainable transport. If you're working with someone in housing, then their agenda might be feasibility or permeability of urban environments. So again, you know, what you have to do is understand where they're coming from, and it's not always a health agenda that delivers the physical activity intervention. It could be about equity, it could be about accessible spaces and places, it could be, so you just have to understand that it's not always about the health of the individual.
So it's really kind of digging to the source and finding out what motivates all the players in the field.
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Thank you ever so much. We have more questions, of course, as usual, which we may keep for the end. And I would then move on to introduce our next speaker. And I'm very pleased to announce that Genevieve Dunton is our last but absolutely not least speaker. She's a professor of population and public health sciences and psychology at the University of Southern California. Her research examines health behaviors related to chronic disease risk in children and adults with a focus on physical activity and nutrition. Dr. Dunton is the director of the USC REACH Lab, which in more words means the Real-Time Eating, Activity and Children's Health Lab. And their goals are to develop, test and apply real-time data capturing methodologies and applications using smartphones and wearable sensors to better understand the effects of psychological, social and environmental factors on eating and physical activity. And now I'll give you the word, and we're going to learn a little more about using intensive longitudinal data to understand physical activity maintenance in the era of COVID-19.
All right, good.
Is anybody else having challenges?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Genevieve. We can, the connection doesn't seem to be that good. We can't actually hear you, and the video is frozen. I don't know, can you hear me? She is in the furthest away, so maybe Zoom is showing us some limitations, but we'll try our best to see if we can get Genevieve back.
She's coming back in.
Okay.
So as she's coming back in, you might need to search for her and unmute her.
All right.
We might have to use this. Oh no, I think so. Genevieve, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can hear you. I'm not sure why my video is not showing, but perhaps if there's a way to enable my video, I'm going to try to share the screen again. Okay, I am sorry about that. You know, it's funny. Everything was fine for the past, hour and a half, and then all of a sudden it just conked out. And I still have no idea where the video is, but that's fine. I'm going to keep going, and my video is on, but you just can't see it.
So we can see your slides perfectly, and we can hear you.
Good.
So yeah,
okay, good,
great.
good. We'll go from there.
Yeah,
okay,
great.
so what I was saying is that it's a huge pleasure to be here, and I've enjoyed the past 3 presentations. I think what I'm going to share today does build and extend on both the surveillance and the theory, and then discuss some of the intervention implications. So certainly it's related to all 3 presentations, but I'm going to discuss some recent theorizing that Alex Rothman and I have been doing surrounding the maintenance of physical activity during the COVID-19 pandemic. And then I'm going to talk about how we can use intensive longitudinal data to better understand these processes. So prior to the pandemic, Alex Rothman and I had been working on a theory that described how people shifted back and forth between automatic and reflective systems to maintain behavior. And but we never imagined that it would be as relevant as it would be today during COVID-19. And so this slide is not meant to be a bunch of doom and gloom, but as much as we might not like to admit it, the pandemic may permanently change some of the ways that we live our lives, and including how we maintain our health behaviors. And physical activity is one such behavior that has been difficult for many people to maintain during the pandemic, but understanding maintenance of physical activity is very important for a number of reasons. And one of them is that in order to lower chronic disease risk, we do need to have sustained engagement in physical activity. It's not something that can be done once or for 1 week, like a vaccination. It needs to be done daily or multiple times per day to have an effect. And then we also know that lapses in physical activity are quite frequent. And in a study by David Conroy, he found that in overweight postmenopausal women, 61% had 1 or more physical activity lapses in a 6-month period. So people are having a challenging time maintaining activity over long periods of time. And then lapses in physical activity can have negative physical and mental health consequences. So even if physical activity starts to decrease substantially for periods as short as 2 weeks, sometimes we start to see cardiovascular benefits starting to diminish. And then lastly, lapses in physical activity can increase our vulnerability to having permanent failure. So lapses can lead to relapses or permanent disengagement with behavior. And so, for example, back in the Conroy study, there was a 39% of the women who lapsed didn't resume activity at all. So long-term physical activity maintenance is difficult, and this is a depiction of what we often see in some of our interventions is that there may be initial adoption during the intervention, but once the intervention ends, often we see that the intervention group may fall back down in terms of their activity levels to a level close to the control group. And so this is a challenge, right? And so in intervention developers, we need to get more information about what might predict maintenance and what might predict lapse, and then how to help people avoid a lapse turning into a permanent disengagement. And here we go. Understanding how to maintain physical activity could be particularly salient now during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we did see, especially during the early months of the pandemic, that many health routines were severely disrupted. And we saw that schools and gyms and fitness centers, parks and playgrounds were all closed, trails, youth sports and activity classes were canceled. And even though thankfully we have passed through hopefully some of the most severe restrictions, there may be new lockdowns, and we continue to face these when there are surges that introduce some of the same barriers to maintaining physical activity. And we collected some physical activity data during the early months of the pandemic. This was between April and May of 2020. And we found that is similar to many other researchers in that during this period, we found on average that physical activity levels did decline quite a bit. But what that slide doesn't show that there was substantial heterogeneity in behavioral response to the pandemic. And there were in fact some people who did quite well in maintaining behavior despite the challenges that COVID-19 may have posed. And so when we look here, this is just a subsample of 131 of those participants, and they did do a pretty good job maintaining at least one bout of physical activity per day. So some people are finding new strategies to maintain physical activity during the challenges of COVID-19. And so perhaps these successful maintainers shifted their behavior to involve new patterns or environments. They may have done physical activity outdoors instead of in gyms and fitness centers, or shifted everything to completely being done at home or remote or through virtual classes. And to understand how to promote long-term maintenance of physical activity in the face of these challenging or life-altering events and circumstances, we really need to dive beneath the surface to examine what is happening with these successful maintainers. And so this builds on Ralph Brand's presentation about the dual process model, and many of our theories of behavior maintenance usually map onto one of the two processes within the dual process model. So we have several theories of maintenance, of behavior maintenance, that map onto automatic processes. So these include our habit theories or theories of hedonic motivation, and those move into more of the affective related theories. But automatic processes are fast and reactive and efficient. They're behaviors that are cued habitually to repeated exposures and context, and this is often without having much conscious awareness. So you engage in a behavior because your context cues you to do it, perhaps sometimes without even realizing it. And this is in contrast to reflective processes or deliberative processes, which are slow and effortful and often controlled, and they may involve more of a complex risk-benefit analysis and decision-making. They may involve more self-regulatory processes or exertion of willpower. And so some of the theories that might explain maintenance that fall under this bin of reflective processes might include the health action process approach or control systems theories. So although we have the dual process model, progress in health behavior maintenance research has been stalled by theories that say little about when and where and why shifts between automatic and reflective systems are occurring, and then how these two systems work together synergistically to support behavior maintenance. So some theories have suggested that reflective theories play a larger role in the adoption of health behaviors, whereas automatic processes contribute more to behavior maintenance. So that's here on the left of the slide. However, there could be some combination of reflective and automatic processes that are involved throughout the entire process, and perhaps those peak somewhere in the middle of moving from adoption to maintenance. Or here on the right, perhaps we see that although reflective processes are more important when someone's trying to change behavior, that we find that both types of processes are relevant and at play during the maintenance period. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And this is the basis of the work and theorizing that Alex that I have been doing. So we would propose that there's flexible shifting between automatic and reflective processes in order to maintain behavior, so that at any given moment, an individual may need to shift back and forth. And this is what's going on underneath the surface in order to maintain behavior under challenging circumstances. So for example, if someone finds themselves in an unusual context, so their gym is closed during COVID-19, they might have been relying on automatic processes that they, in terms of their context and routine and habit, to go to the gym every day, but they may need to shift to reflective processes in order to maintain that behavior. And in the case where there's low stress for that individual, they can probably successfully engage in the problem solving and planning that would be needed. But if they're under high stress, these reflective processes may not work as well, and they might not engage in the behavior. There could be a lapse. And on the other hand, if someone is under high stress, but they're in their usual context, although the reflective processes are perhaps maybe not would not be as effective, they can rely back on automatic processes, and hopefully those would keep their behavior going despite the fact that they're experiencing high stress. So the way that we have think about this is that it can be difficult, though, to capture this shifting back and forth. This could happen at the moment-to-moment level or the daily level, and part of it's because of our methods. And we typically capture and measure our behaviors and determinants infrequently, and that may be using retrospective or summary measures, especially of these psychosocial factors. And our measures usually capture usual levels of behaviors and determinants, and this is usually across a typical week or month. So we can't, using those measures, we can't necessarily capture the frequent shifting back and forth. And they're not really conducive, these methods, to testing factors that vary over a micro time scale, so over minutes and hours. So for this reason, it could be particularly helpful to use intensive longitudinal data collection, and that has the potential to address many of these limitations. So ILD includes high frequency, high density, repeated measures data collection over a micro time scale, so it could be across seconds, minutes, or hours, or days, and typically in the real world setting. And there are a number of types of ILD methods and devices, and these are usually mobile and wearable sensors, but they can include self-report in real time through ecological momentary assessment, usually on a smartphone device, or through body movement, motion sensing. We can collect GPS data, look at social interactions and communication patterns also in real time through our mobile devices. So there are a number of triggers that may influence the timing of the shifting between automatic and reflective systems. And these may include interrupting established contextual cues. So in the example I gave before, when there's a cancellation or bad weather, someone's traveling, major life event, or obviously a pandemic, that can trigger shifting between automatic and reflective systems. But then there also may be other triggers, and one of them might be having a limited availability of psychological assets. So if someone's attention and focus is depleted because of various demands, or their emotion regulation capacity, or perhaps even physical energy is depleted, they might not be able to engage in reflective decision making and may need to fall back on automatic processes. And then another trigger is having a lack of intrinsic or repetitive motives. So activity can become boring if the same activity is performed over long periods of time, or individuals may experience pain or dissatisfaction, or the behavior can be unpleasant, as our friend had said. And in this case, there may be a need to rely much more on reflective processes to overcome some of these challenges. So these are the triggers that influence the timing. Now, the interesting thing here, get this to advance, there we go, is that there's these triggers have unique properties that have been difficult to measure through our traditional measures, and they may require intensive longitudinal data. And so these properties of these triggers that are listed there on the left, the properties, they may fluctuate over short periods of time. So from hour to hour or across day to day. These triggers can increase or decrease over a function of time. So over a month, they may increase linearly or curvilinearly. These triggers may be situationally dependent. So in certain contexts or under certain situations, we see these triggers occurring. And they may have idiographic phenomenology, which means that the triggers may have differing importance for individuals based on unique characteristics of those individuals. So the same triggers may have different effects across people. So, all right, trying to get this to advance. There we go. And so during the COVID-19 pandemic, we could begin to see, here's just a very oversimplified example of how there may need to be flexible shifting between an automatic system to a reflective system when conditions change, and then perhaps shifting back. And this may be necessary to maintain behavior. So perhaps this person was a successful maintainer across this entire period. And so if we just look at their behavior on the surface, it looks like they did fine. But under the surface, there was potentially a lot of shifting going on as they had to shift from exercising in a gym. The gym closes, and then they had to engage in reflective processing, and they found a new place to be active outdoors and maybe built a habit around that. But then winter came and they had to do more reflective decision making, found a place indoors, exercising online. Maybe they caught COVID, and then there was a whole bunch of other challenges. So this shifting back and forth leads us to think about this as perhaps, instead of purely just stable habit driven behavior, that we are maybe entering an era of flexible habits. And this era of flexible habits then would require shifting back and forth between automatic and reflective systems. And this would enable the maintenance of behavior without lapses or relapses. And it suggests that maintenance of behavior is not governed by automatic decision making only, which had been something that had been proposed in earlier theories. And under certain conditions, then this flexible shifting back and forth between the two systems could be ideal. So then in terms of the COVID-19 era and beyond, we're going to need strong behavior maintenance theories more than ever, given that our circumstances could be uncertain. And the new theories would need to specify the timing of the interplay between automatic and reflective systems. So are these occurring, is the shifting sequential, or are the automatic and reflective systems both being activated at the same time simultaneously? And then across what timescales does the shifting occur? And does one system predominate, or one system predominate for one type of individual? And the new theories would need to specify why, where, and how the automatic and reflective systems interact to maintain health behaviors. And so is there shifting when contexts change, under high stress or fatigue? And then are these associations between the predictors and behavior linear or curvilinear? Are there certain thresholds that are necessary? So there's a whole bunch of more specification that is needed in our theories to better drive our interventions. But I just want to end with one example of how we can think about using intensive longitudinal data to think about developing interventions. So when we use these methods, we can begin to identify a period when an individual might be vulnerable to a lapse. So perhaps when the context changes. And so in this case, these are data from one of our ongoing studies where we asked people whether they were engaging in their usual routine every day. And it goes from not at all to very much so. And so these are some days that have been highlighted here when they're saying they're not in their usual routine at all. So these are days when individual could be vulnerable to lapse unless they shift and start to engage in reflective processes. So this would be a high-risk period where a just-in-time intervention strategy could be helpful. So I just want to end, again, not on a doom and gloom moment, but that when we have a number of changes that are ongoing in this day and age, changes to our climate, changes in relation to the frequency of pandemics. So it's possible we might not go back to an old normal and have a new normal that could involve more of these situations, fires, weather events, or climatic changes. So therefore, it's even more pertinent that we understand and learn to promote these microtemporal shifts and flexible habits if we want to help maintain healthy behaviors during uncertain times. So I will end there with thanking the research team, and you can always go to our Reach Lab website to get more information. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your very intriguing presentation. I think it was very nice the way we could loop back around to our effective reflective theories and look at it from a maintenance point of view, and how COVID is challenging a lot of us with regard to physical activity. So again, the floor is now open to the audience for entering comments into the chat. And I see we have some questions for you. I was wondering to what extent this reasoning could be applied not only to habits, but also to other less context-dependent automatic processes, such as implicit attitudes or approach avoidance tendencies.
Yes, that's interesting as well, because thinking about implicit attitudes, certainly there's work suggesting that they're not purely a trait level phenomenon. And I'd be curious to hear what Ralph Braun would think about this as well, but that there is some evidence, and we've been trying to use an IAT, a mobile IAT task, where individuals will complete that task multiple times per day or multiple times per week. And we do see some fluctuation in some of these implicit attitudes. The challenge is teasing apart learning effects, in that type of research. But the question being is that would we potentially see shifting perhaps from automatic processes such as implicit attitudes to more deliberate processes under these circumstances? And I think that we could see that, especially if there's a reason why one's implicit attitudes are more negative at one time versus another. And that when that happens, then there may need to be a shift to more deliberative decision-making in order to maintain behavior.
So also about getting to the bottom of it, to the why something is happening in a certain moment. Ralph Braun, would you like to add anything to that?
Happy to do that, yes. What I think is important in discussing this or similar issues is that that label dual system theory or dual process theories is a semantic container for various separate theories and various perspectives on what's going on. And one important distinction is that between like psychological dual process or dual system theories that relate to the process of information processing. That is, like in the ART, for example, we would always look at the situational state. That is, there is a stimulus, my partner's telling me go up, go exercising, and what happens in that immediate moment. So that's the social cognition, the psychological process behind it. On the other hand, literature from colleagues who deal with habits, for example, use a more broader definition of that dual systems, and that's how I understood you, Genevieve. Now that there is like a system governing behavior in the long term, in the midterm, or with respect to longer time periods. So whereas the ART focuses on that situation, that moment, and the information, how the information is processed, that broader definition of dual process rather refers to a behavioral system, something like that. And so if we separate that, it might be easier to come together at one point.
Thank you very much for those further insights on implicit associations. I think it's a topic in which we could further discuss a lot. However, considering the time, I would like to now hand over to Jan Niklas, who will guide us through the final steps of this webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. Yeah, we come to the end of the main part of today's webinar. And first of all, yeah, we want to thank all the 4 speakers for their presentations around the topic, what is needed to promote physical activity. And yeah, second to the audience for the good questions. And yeah, now we have some minutes left, and surely some questions or feedback have accumulated, which will also lead to a link to the different presentations and discussions we have heard. And we have 10 minutes left where you are still allowed to ask questions. And for a good and orderly process, please write your names in the chat. And then we can, as long as the time is enough, call one person after the other to ask her questions. Then you can unmute yourself for asking your questions. And I want to start with one final questions to Ralf and Regina. The question was from Jana Semrau, and the question was, where would you see the effective reflective theory within a whole system approach recommended by the WHO GAPA to promote physical activity, as Regina Guthold presented?
Thanks for the question. I would locate the theory in the situation, in the moments when somebody has decided to join in an exercise or physical activity session. That is, what the ART is highlighting is that how do people feel during exercise or during physical activity, and the traces in memories that are created by this experience. And that memories in a not only cognitive but very bodily sense will have an effect on people's further decisions. So I would relate the ART to the moment, from an interventional perspective, to the moment when somebody shows up at an intervention session or program, and you have to decide what you would like to do with them during that session.
Yeah, thank you, Ralf. Regina, you want to add something?
Thank you very much. I have nothing to add.
Okay.
I think Catherine has something to add. Did I see that correctly?
Yeah, thank you. And Ralph, what I think you were touching on there is the constant debate between physiology and psychology in relation to moderate to vigorous. The recommendation that we have at the moment for physical activity is moderate to vigorous physical activity. If you take walking, which is the most popular form of physical activity behavior, the psychology field will advocate for moderate intensity walking. Go out for a walk, enjoy the walk, and it will happen regularly. Whereas the more physiology oriented individuals would say, no, it has to be at a certain speed, and you're not walking fast enough, and you have to walk faster. And the danger there is in increasing the intensity, you go across the affective reflective gap, and it destroys the pleasance of the walk. So That's exactly, to me, what you're tapping into. And you're quite correct. In GAPA, it comes in under the active people pillar, particularly. That's where it comes in under.
Exactly. Thank you very much, Catherine. What I would like to emphasize is that intensity plays a crucial role in the first phases, in the first steps in intervention programs. Probably you should not, or actually I think that you should never start with moderate to vigorous intensity with someone who is simply not used to the feelings created by that intensity. So in the early steps of the intervention, keep your focus on presenting intensities that feel pleasurable. And then after a few days or weeks in the program, you can elevate or increase intensities, and people will learn to like it in the sense I explained that.
Yes, I think the next question is from Claudio. You have to unmute yourself. Yes.
Thanks, everyone. I've just answered that. You guys just answered my questions, because we really have two theories and two applies in the presentations, and we see how they just integrated each other, which is a great piece. So pass on to Marcus.
Thanks a lot for the highly interesting talks today. And I want to add on Genevieve's talk. So Genevieve, you mentioned that the intensive longitudinal data offers much value when asking the question, what drives physical activity? And so far, the theories have mainly been tested using cross-sectional studies. And I want to ask a very broad question. So how to combine those mainly cross-sectional between subject theories with the new within subject approaches and studies? So how can we learn from the between subject theories and combine them with new intensive longitudinal data sets?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think that our theories that come from the between-person studies are a useful starting place, but what the intensive longitudinal data methods allow us to do is to add various types of specificity to those theories, so we can begin to look for context specificity. So whereas we may have thought about these theories as enacting equally across context, we can now test that. We can look at temporal specificity in our existing theories, so we can look at across what types of timescales do the effects unfold, and it could be short term or long term, and then we can look at person specificity. So this is really looking at the idiographic effects, and the challenge is that when we say the word theory, there's an inherent assumption about the theories being nomothetic, and that the whole point of a theory is that you can describe perhaps a generalizable levels of behavior across groups, and that was necessary when we were looking at cross-sectional or head between person methods. But with intensive longitudinal data, and we can collect enough data points on a person that we can develop idiographic models or N of 1 models where we have 100 or 1,000 time points on a person, and in a sense, then we can look at that idiographic variation across people. So there's going to be an incredible potential that that ILD offers for expanding and enhancing our theories in these ways.
And we would give the last question to Charlotte Lemuel. You can also unmute yourself for asking your question.
Robin, can you unmute her?
Yeah, it's
okay.
The
Great.
host has unmuted me. Thank you very much. Yes, my question was on, I have the impression most of the focus for interventions are limited to the leisure time that people have. However, a lot of day-to-day life is spent either at school or at work. And I was wondering, within the systems perspective of the GAPA, is there ideas to promote more physically active working or school conditions as well? Because, for example, sitting time, the vast majority of my sitting time is at work. And so just reducing the couple of hours I spend sitting at home might not be the most effective.
Ralph, you want to start to answer, and then we switch to Catherine?
So actually, I thought that this question might go to Regina.
Or to Regina, yeah.
Yeah, I'm happy to start on that one. Thank you very much.
Perfect.
Well, I think physical activity promotion should be across all areas of the life, and that's the message that I think the GAPA tries to get across. That is why we need to work with other sectors. That is why we need to work with the transport sector, for example, to increase physical activity for transport. That is why we need to work, for example, with the education sector, that we try to increase physical activity at school, with other sectors that are responsible for implementing physical activity promotion at work, having walking meetings and these kinds of things. So I think that's a message that the GAPA wants to get across, that physical activity promotion needs to happen across all domains and not only leisure time. Happy for somebody to add if somebody would like to add something.
Yeah, Catherine here, just to add to that, I would draw reference to the 8 investments, the best buys for physical activity. So if you go on to the International Society for Physical Activity and Health, you will see that aligned with GAPA, they've published the 8 investments that work. And within that, you have the domains within which physical activity is published. And there you have a whole of school for which there's good evidence. So there you have within, one of them would be the whole of school interventions. Another one would be workplace interventions. Another one would be primary care and integrating physical activity into primary care, and so on and so forth. So there are 8 different domains identified within that for which we have evidence, that good evidence, robust evidence, that they are important domains for the promotion of physical activity.
Yes, Ralph.
Yes, and from my point of view, it's important to see that of course exercise is an efficient way to be physically active. There is something which is easy to achieve with lighter forms of physical activity, like, for example, going out for a walk or standing during presentations or things like that, because all these daily activities outside of deliberately chosen activities during leisure times are moderately, in a sense, are lightly physical, intensive. So they will give you good feelings. So starting into physical activity or exercise intervention programs might be even easier if you start with just let people change their daily behavior before help them decide to go exercising in higher intensity somewhere.
Thank you, Ralph, and thank you all for the good questions and good answers. And I think now we will come to the end of this webinar, and I will lead to Claudio, yes, for the last words and for summarizing the webinar this evening.
So I'm going to try and do some interactive presentation. Here is Loki. He's enjoying all of your talks. Loki is a cat. cats are actually, they make you feel good because they're cuddly and they purr when you're here, obviously in an academic setting, but they are actually decreasing physical activity. Data has shown that, whereas dogs will increase physical activity. So I think what we have is, although the emotion is positive, oh, now he leaves. The emotion is positive. The cat certainly doesn't work in motivating, but a dog might. So what we can see is we can incorporate the positive emotion within the system. And I think that's what we're seeing with the two more theoretical presentation and the two more applied or intervention geared presentations. We need to look at not only whether it's a cat or a dog, but we need to look at the system in where the emotions or those quick decisions are made, the community and the supporting organizations, along with the policies and the environment. With that, I'd like to thank everyone, and I hope you were thought that I was quite ingenious in incorporating my cat into the summary. Thank you for the speakers, Regina, Catherine, Genevieve, and Ralph. Excellent job. I also tip my hat to Robin, Vivian, and Jan. Great job for getting this exciting and very rich webinar together. And Sasha, who's somewhere stuck in Berlin airport, for his help in behind the scenes. And last but not least, I'd like to thank the Swiss Society of Sport Sciences to support this international event. And of course, you, the audience, who's shown interest. Reach out to our speakers, reach out to us if you have questions. We will also be sharing when we have a link up to the webinar itself. Thank you all, and we've been inactive for over 2 hours. Get up, stretch out, maybe do some jumping jacks or go for a walk, or if you'd like more intense exercise, do that also. Appreciate everybody for taking their time to join us, and thank you all. Have a great day.